Hello, my name is Mitch Lutzke, and the cover that was preceding my discussion here is the cover of my book, The Page Fence Giants, A History of Black Baseball's Pioneering Champions, published by McFarland in April of 2018. It was awarded a Michigan Notable Book Award in January of 2019, and then I was sent around the state along with other authors who were interested in doing so and spreading the word of our book, and in this case, The Page Fence Giants, around the state of Michigan. I've also given speeches in Indiana and over some Zoom calls as well. So this is something that is near and dear to my heart, and it was a team I knew nothing about 5 years ago, and now I've stumbled upon this team that was relegated to the dustbins of baseball and 19th century baseball. And so I resurrected what I stumbled upon researching another book, and thus the Page Fence Giants book was born. It's the first book ever on this team. After 125 or so years, there have been a few articles here and there, a couple of paragraphs in some books, but really nothing in depth about this World Championship team. And so I'm going to basically tell you about the team, why it's important to know, and how it contributed to hopefully setting the stage for the 1920 season, as the Negro League Centennial Symposium will focus on those organized teams in 1920 and onward. But this team was based in Michigan and ran from 1895 to 1898, and it was a World Championship team in 1896. I'm wearing my replica 1895 Page Fence Giants jersey here. And they had a couple of jerseys over the time, but this is the one that was used in 1895. So without further ado, I'm going to speak to you about the pioneering black professional baseball team, the Page Fence Giants. The Page Fence Giants were a professional black baseball team that operated from 1895 to 1898 in Adrian, Michigan, which is a town about 35 miles west of Detroit. It was sponsored by the Page Fence Woven Wire Fence Company, owned by J. Wallace Page, a former Civil War soldier who traveled back home to the Adrian area and set up a factory that made special fencing. And it was in squares, kind of like a waffle design, and it became very popular. And incidentally, Adrian became the fence capital of the world by the turn of the last century. The story of Adrian's Page Fence Giants was the original starting title. So I wrote this book trying to encompass more than just hard statistics and game play-by-plays. So some of my strongest compliments have been from non-baseball people or casual baseball people who have said that they enjoyed the history aspect I put in the book. I'm a high school history teacher and sociology teacher and video teacher, so I added some sociological aspects to this. And I said that, simply put, game scores and statistics don't tell what you need to know about this team, these men, and the country. This book is the story of Adrian's Page Fence Giants, and not a book only geared towards stat heads and baseball nerds. One woman said that was her favorite line in the book. I said, well, it was in the preface. I hope you read the rest of the book. So I wanted to let you know that not only do I talk about the team, but I put the team as best I can in the context of the times in the 1890s in the United States. Reconstruction had been over for about 15 years in this country. You start to see the rise of Jim Crow laws, not only in the South, but in the North. You have the Gentleman's Agreement in the late 1880s, ushered in by Cap Anson and others to try to push black professional baseball players out of the major leagues and really any league that was going to play with white players. So I talk about the lawsuit Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, which was a Supreme Court case that allowed separate but equal facilities in the United States, one of the worst Supreme Court rulings of all time, which was overturned in 1954 largely by Brown versus Board of Education. So if you're looking for a book that kind of places this team within the context of United States history, this is the book for you. Before I go on about how the team was organized, you might be saying, if this team was a world championship team in 1896, why don't I know about them? Well, that's a good point. And let me kind of tell you this. Saul White, who played a portion of 1895 with the team, is in the National Baseball Hall of Fame, and probably three other players, Bud Fowler, Grant Home Run Johnson, and lefty pitcher George Wilson, probably should be in the Hall of Fame, in my personal opinion. So this was a team that won a World Black Baseball Championship, but had significant players in baseball who really helped lay the groundwork for the 1920 Negro leagues to start up in the YMCA in Kansas City, Missouri. But getting back to my original premise, why do we not know more about a world championship black baseball team with one Hall of Fame player on and others of Hall of Fame caliber? And I came up with about four ideas. Number one is, as I started a few minutes ago, or stated a few minutes ago, no books have ever been written on this team. You find a few pages here or there in professional journals and blurbs in paragraphs talking about pre-1920 black baseball. So first of all, there wasn't a focus on this team because there just was nothing written about it. By 1920, the more established Negro leagues were to the forefront of baseball, particularly black baseball, and I think they wanted to leave the barnstorming players behind them. They wanted to have leagues, and they wanted to mimic the major leagues of the American League and the National League, the white league, so to speak. So giving credence or glory to barnstorming teams that traveled around the country probably wasn't in the best interest of the Negro League. And I don't think the Negro Leagues wanted competition from a barnstorming team. They wanted you to go to their league teams based in certain cities. A couple of other items I think that make it important as to why maybe the Page Fence Giants were ignored was in Robert Peterson's landmark book, Only the Ball Was White. He says in the beginning that he was only going to write about ball players that people had seen, so he eliminates ball players from the late 1800s and early 1900s. So his focus was on the more modern players. It's a great book, but it leaves the Page Fence Giants out. As a matter of fact, he mentions Chappie Johnson and the Page Fence Giants, I believe, in there for there's like a paragraph or something. The other item, and Saul White's in the Baseball Hall of Fame. He played from about June to October in 1895 on the Page Fence Giants team. He was not on the championship team in 1896. He was not even, from what I could research, the top half of the best ball players on the Page Fence Giants that year. In his 1907 landmark book that he wrote about black baseball, he doesn't really mention the Page Fence Giants with anything just but passing notice, if I remember correctly, a sentence or two. So when the person in the Hall of Fame plays on your team and he doesn't really spend much time on it, I think that's another strike against why we don't know about the Page Fence Giants. Now that I hopefully have set the context and the backdrop of the Page Fence Giants and what was going on in the country and why they've been ignored for over a century, let's talk about the specifics. And first of all, why in the heck was an all-star team of black baseball players who will evolve into the 1896 World Black Baseball Champions based in Adrian, Michigan? That's a good point. It all starts a year before in 1894. Adrian had wrongly claimed themselves as the baseball capital of Michigan. They had lost a grudge series of matches to Pontiac, Michigan, and Monroe, but it didn't matter. The local baseball cranks had baseball fever, and they challenged all comers to come to town to play the Adrian Light Guard Armory team. Well, the Findlay Sluggers in northern Ohio were a professional baseball team, an integrated team, and two of their big stars, if not the big stars, were African-American icon Bud Fowler and Grant Home Run Johnson, a teenager who played shortstop for the team. So they would come to your town and you'd split the gate with them and they'd have side bets and they would just really beat you. Well, they showed up in August of 1894 and they beat the living daylights out of the Adrian team, which also was integrated. George Wilson was a teenage pitcher from down the road in Palmyra, Michigan, but he was very impressive. So what had happened was Bud Fowler, who had been playing professional baseball for nearly 20 years at this time, had announced that he was going to put together an all-star traveling black baseball team in 1895 based in Findlay, Ohio. But after two humongous crowds and enthusiasm in Adrian, he lets out what we call a trial balloon, and Fowler says, if you can guarantee me basically $500 profit at the end of the season, I'll locate the team in Adrian. And the Findlay Sluggers get back on the train and they go back to their home base in Ohio. It only took Adrian a month to come up with the money and the supporters, and lo and behold, on September 21st, 1894, the two daily papers in Adrian blared the headlines, "The Page Fence Giants will be here in 1895." And this was an racially integrated ownership group. Bud Fowler and Grant Home Run Johnson were going to be owners, along with Howard and Rolla Taylor, two businessmen that opened a general store, hardware store, sporting goods store previous years in Adrian. The former mayor of Adrian, current postmaster Len Hawk. And then they got J. Wallace Page, the owner of the Page Woven Wire Fence Company, to back the club. And he actually bought a train car to allow them to travel around the country and to sidestep Jim Crow laws as they were playing throughout the Midwest and Canada. And so this group of men came together and announced the Page Fence Giants would be based in 1895 in Adrian, Michigan. And then Bud Fowler was in charge of the team, and he was going to start signing players in the wintertime. And so he starts raiding rosters of other black teams and of black players that were playing semi-professionally around the Midwest. So that's the genesis of the Page Fence Giants. Why Adrian? There's a lot of reasons, and quickly I'll go over them. Not only did they think they had baseball fever, when the baseball capital, it was a very progressive town. They had a progressive college headed up by Asa Mahan, who had come from Oberlin College, a very progressive liberal college in Ohio. Adrian also was a stop on the Underground Railroad during the Civil War, and Adrian had a vibrant black middle class that was not segregated, as best I can tell. I looked through the census reports for decades, and African Americans were found living and having businesses in all four wards of the city, including having businesses on Main Street. So the African American community was ingrained in Adrian. They were part of the community. They were a large portion of Adrian, and their schools had always been integrated. And so this was a place that would have accepted this idea of a black professional baseball team being based in their hometown of Adrian, Michigan. Now, while Bud Fowler was trying to sign black baseball players in the winter of 1894 to 1895, the white portion of the management team, the Taylor brothers and Hawk, they decided to start a white team, or a team in the white Michigan State League, which will actually be integrated, and they're called the Adrian Demons. And as they were looking for ball players, they decided that George Wilson would not be playing for the Page Fence Giants all year. He would be playing for the Adrian Demons, as would his catcher, Vasco Graham, another African-American gentleman. So Adrian's got two management groups putting on two baseball teams. And I talk about the media coverage because the media coverage really centers on this mostly white MSL team of the Adrian Demons. But we'll get back to that in a minute. When I give a longer presentation, I go into some media distortion and media coverage in much greater detail, and often get questions about it. But for here, I'll just let you know that the media coverage was not equal between the black Page Fence Giants, even though they were basically the marketing tool for the town and the number one employer. The Page Fence Company had hundreds and hundreds of employees in the east side of town. The Adrian Demons got a lot more publicity and box scores and line scores and stories in all of the Adrian newspapers, be it weekly or the daily newspapers. But back to the Page Fence Giants. So what happens is the Page Fence Company decides to buy a train car, which I'm going to show right here, an elaborate train car. I found a comparable cost, maybe worth $30,000 back in the day, and it was totally equipped with everything that you could need. They found Lawrence Park on the west side of Adrian to play the ball field, the ball games in. And so they were starting to make Adrian their home base. They hired a cook, William Gaskin, a fascinating figure, a Michigan native, and a porter, barber, Albert C. Carter, that first year, an Adrian native, to wait on the ball players. So they would have the plushest of accommodations and servants to them. And then the Page Fence Giants during the year, by the way, did loan 6 players to the integrated Adrian Demons ball team. So what happens is At the end of March, a couple of ball players joining Adrian. Carter and Gaskin are on the train. They take the train car down to Marion, Indiana. They have spring training down there for a week or so. They pick up a game with the Gas City locals down there, and they beat them really badly. The Page Fence Giants, though, then play the Indianapolis team, a high minor league team, and get beat pretty soundly. And so early on, the management of the Page Fence Giants were looking for replacement players. Where did the Page Fence Giants play in their 4 years? We've documented them in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, and throughout Ontario, particularly along the Windsor, Toronto, Hamilton area. When they beat Gas City and they lost to Indianapolis, they played the Cincinnati Reds. Yes, the Cincinnati Reds that we know today in the National League. And they played a very close game. They actually led the game for several innings and got very positive write-ups in some paragraphs in the Cincinnati papers. The second game was not as close, but some shifty umpiring or shaky umpiring comes into play. And that's a theme in my book. This idea that the Page Fence Giants were always going into a town, largely white, with white ball players and white fans and white umpires, and going to get a fair shake is not accurate. And so I talk about that in detail in the book. So the Page Fence Giants go around the country in 1895. They win like 130 some games. They lose like 20 or so. And the reason the win-loss record isn't legit is because Gus Parsons, their white business manager, publicly said, in games that we've been ripped off by umpires, we don't count those as losses. So the famous 72-game winning streak, and another was like 89 games, they actually, in the 72-game winning streak, lost at least 3 games I could find that year, but they just discounted them because everything was shaky. What was interesting, though, and we're going to the sociological aspect, was when the Page Fence Giants came back to Adrian in the early summer of 1895 to play the Adrian Demons, the local paper and the local media thought that the Adrian Demons were going to win. The largely white ball team, other than Graham and Wilson, were going to kill the Page Fence Giants. It was exactly the opposite. And it's very enlightening to notice the media coverage of the ball players and what was emphasized as positive and negative traits and things such as this. As I went around and read newspapers around the Midwest, both online and going to places that had like libraries, you could see where communities were accepting of black ball players, others who were outright racist, used the N-word, caricatures of them, and such. And so you could kind of get a microcosm of how the United States was dealing with this racial situation that has been around since we've been a territory hundreds and hundreds of years ago. After the June games between the Adrian Demons and the Page Fence Giants, there's a management shakeup. It's probably a little before that in Wisconsin, but Bud Fowler and Grant Home Run Johnson are no longer part of the management team. They're getting a salary. Ball players back then were getting paid $75, $80 a month, $100 for a pitcher. Saul White joins the team from a Fort Wayne minor league team that collapsed, pushes Fowler from second base to right field. So there's a shakeup there. In addition, in mid-June, there's a tragedy on the team. Their star center fielder, great hitter, and even better fielder, Gus Brooks, collapses during a game in Hastings, Michigan, is carted back to the hotel a few blocks, and then promptly dies at the end when the players come back. So he is buried at Oakwood Cemetery in Adrian, Michigan, with a monument marker purchased only a few years ago by the Sabre Group. So you've got some big events going on with the Page Fence Giants. At the end of the year, the Adrian Demons, the white minor league team, does not make money, and the ownership says we're not coming back. But the Page Fence Giants made money, and they announced that they would be back in 1896, based in Adrian, Michigan. They sign a few players. Charles Grant comes in. Saul White leaves. They've got Bill Binga on the team, a great third baseman catcher that comes onto the team. And I want to read the roster. I have a master roster from every year in the back because this is the championship team. George Taylor played first. Charles Grant second, Grant Johnson, that's home run Johnson, shortstop, James John Patterson at third base for most of the year. Vasco Graham played catcher and outfield. Pete Burns played catcher. Bill Binga played third base and catcher. Joe Miller was a pitcher outfielder. Billy Holland, a pitcher and a left fielder. George Wilson, a lefty pitcher. Fred Van Dyke, a pitcher, center fielder. James Chavis from Ohio, pitcher and right fielder. And Frank Waters, a teenager from Adrian, was put in a couple of times for games, as was William Wendell Gaskin, their cook from the previous year. He was also there in 1896. So that's the core of your championship team. So they go around the country and they're winning games just as much as they did in the first year. And there's a challenge from them by the Cuban ex-Giants out east for a series of games. And history has really kind of botched this. The games, there was originally going to be a 12-game series, then it was 15, then it was 17, then it was 19, because they kept drawing all over Indiana, Ohio, and Michigan. And let me tell you how kind of hodgepodgey the media coverage was. The Cuban Giants is what the Adrian paper said for the entire 2.5 weeks or so of the coverage. That's who they were playing. But actually, it was the Cuban ex-Giants. They had broken away from the Cuban Giants and had their own team that year. So even the media couldn't even get the correct teams in black baseball's World Championship. Grant Home Run Johnson mostly played shortstop. He pitched a game in Cairo, Michigan, up in the thumb, and it was the championship game. It put them over of the majority of the wins in the 15-game series. They later on added a couple of more, which the Cuban ex-Giants claimed were part of the series, but they weren't. They still didn't win them all. And so there was a celebration in Adrian, apparently somewhat subdued. The players were given a tour of the Page Fence factory. They were given a medal, I believe with their name on it, with the Page Fence insignia, and they were greeted by the owner of the factory. Some of the ball players stayed in Adrian in the offseason in these 4 years. Others went back home. And so they were the world champions in 1896 of black baseball. The media was used to snipe at each other. The Cuban ex-Giants manager had said the only reason that the Cuban ex-Giants had lost was their players had a bunch of Charlie horses and were older. And the younger team won just by luck and pluck. Yes, they outbeat them and they outscored them in runs, but the Cuban ex-Giants had more hits, which really doesn't matter. It's, just win, baby. But that was interesting to see in the sporting news and in some of the papers as the coverage was still sparse, but it was still out there. In 1897, the team is back on the road again, but there's almost no preseason coverage in the Adrian papers. They don't even have a roster of the players as they had the first 2 years. They don't mention anything about a porter or a chef. They don't talk about the train car hardly at all, and it makes it very difficult to follow the team. In 1897, there's also no Michigan State white team, so to speak. So the baseball fever is definitely not being transmitted towards the black baseball players. In 1897, Lawrence Park gets sold to a Detroit and Lima railroad company, which ends up going belly up, but they tear up the ball field and they have to move the stands and things. And so the park is no longer going to be the home base for the Adrian team, who only played 6 or 7 home games a year, it seems, in Adrian. They played a couple at the fairgrounds. And then in 1898, there's almost no preseason coverage about the comings and goings of the players. There is no minor league team that year. There is no really local ballpark, so they end up playing in towns like Tecumseh as the local place. It's hard to find scores. The first year you could find a lot of the scores and some line scores and some details. By 1898, you would go 2 and 3 weeks in the Adrian papers without finding a score. I read over 400 hours of the Sporting News, Sporting Life, Adrian Daily Times and Expositor, Adrian Evening Telegram, Adrian Daily Telegram, and other papers. So I read from cover to cover because I wanted to find out the life, again, as a sociology teacher, of what was going on at the time. In 1898, a series of things hit the country that had nothing to do with the Page Fence Giants because they had made money in every year, including their final year in Adrian of 1898. In addition to having no local ballpark, The Spanish-American War starts in April, and the local armory is all abuzz about the National Guard, what we call it now, is from Adrian, and the Adrian area men are being sent to the battlefield. Actually, they spent most of their time in Tennessee. So that's covering things. One of the local yokel baseball guys, Seymour Howell, is an officer in the military. He's an older gentleman, and he seemed to be kind of a baseball crank that shows up every once in a while. He's shipped out into the military. Len Hawk, the former mayor of the town and postmaster, moves to Coldwater to start a cement company. And all you have in town is the Taylor brothers, and the baseball club is no longer a priority. But the other thing that really, really hurt the team that I found was the Steel Trust. The East Coast Steel Trust was not selling steel to the Page Fence Woven Fence Company for them to make the raw material, and it was really hurting them. So J. Wallace Page decided to open a factory in Monessen, Pennsylvania, which took a lot of time and money, and the Steel Trust kind of jacked him around on even supplying raw materials out there. And I think J. Wallace Page figured out that I can't have a marketing team on the road, because basically they rode into your town. The local merchant that sold the fence company would pass out leaflets and flyers and calendars and say, hey, you think the team is really good beating the locals, how good do you think our fence is? So it was an advertising tool, absolutely. But for J. Wallace Page, it became difficult to have an expensive advertising campaign when you could not produce the woven wire. Sometimes they were like hundreds of miles behind in orders, and they shipped all over the world: Australia, New York, Bronx, Berlin. So this was an international company. And I think the combination of the Spanish-American War, some of the baseball cranks not being there, and the trust really hurt the team. And they were sold to a group of black businessmen in the south side of Chicago. And in 1899, the Page Fence Giants, about 7 or 8 of the 12 or 13 players, became the Columbia Giants. Because I know some of you like to know about won-loss records, I'm going to throw up the 4 years of the won-loss records that was published in the Detroit Free Press in like 1901 or 1902. Again, these are subject to debate. Early on, the Page Fence Giants in 1895, and I don't think it lasted too long, to be honest with you, had red Monarch brand bicycles and red hats like firemen's hats, and they would get off the train and they would parade through town and like Pied Pipers get people to go to the ballpark. But it apparently that didn't last for too many weeks, because I never saw that mentioned really the last 2 or 3 years of the team showing up, because they were basically filling the stands with their ability to play ball. One other thing about the train car I kind of want to focus on, that was a train car that was hooked to the back of a regular train and was pulled into town. They'd go off on the side track. If the town was hostile to African Americans, then they could eat and sleep on the train car. It was like a fancy Pullman car, but it had china in it and leather seats. If they could find a hotel in town, they went to the hotel. If not, they could stay on the train car. So that was a very important item for them to go across basically sections of racist America who wanted to see the ball players and be entertained by them, but maybe did not want to serve them dinner or give them a bed to sleep in. So another thing is there's a movie a friend of mine did on the Page Fence Giants, and particularly Bud Fowler is actually the focus, not the Giants so much. If you're interested, I'll throw it up right there, and I'm in that. Again, my book, The Page Fence Giants, A History of Black Baseball's Pioneering Champions, was published by McFarland. It also won a Robert Peterson Book Award for African American Studies last year. So thank you very much for listening to me, and I hope you enjoyed everything you learned today about the Page Fence Giants, pioneers of black baseball before the Negro Leagues.